Good afternoon, and welcome to the Michigan Department of Education's Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series. I'm Corinne Edwards, and I have the privilege of serving as the Director of the Office of Educational Supports here at the MDE. This is the fourth topic in a series that the department is offering associated with a comprehensive teaching of U.S. and world history. This series is the vision of our State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Dr. Michael Rice. It is through this vision that we advance our efforts to provide an assurance of Michigan students having opportunities to learn history from a comprehensive stance. As such, the MDE remains committed to the teaching of history through diverse viewpoints while highlighting historical movements and moments that have shaped our nation. Today, we are fortunate to have an exceptional presenter, Dr. Pamela Brandwein, a professor at the University of Michigan's Department of Political Science, back again to round out our learning about how amendments to the U.S. Constitution following the Civil War were pivotal to the progress of our nation. We welcome Dr. Brandwein back for this third installment and eagerly await today's presentation. As educators, we have the responsibility to teach the full breadth of history to our children. This broad effort will help you as educators learn more about historical movements, events, and peoples that are part of the complex, diverse history of our country and our world, and by extension, help you explore the same comprehensive history with your students. Again, we are grateful for our presenter today and truly thank Dr. Brandwein for sharing her expertise and assisting in the growth of knowledge and understanding amongst our educators. I'd also like to thank the Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series team, including our interpreter for today, Jennifer, for its continued efforts in identifying and selecting key topics and for arranging and organizing this virtual space for us to gather and learn. Finally, I'd like to thank you, our attendees, for joining us on this teaching and learning journey. Thank you all for your intentionality, interest, and courage in support of our students, which we refer to as our professional true north, and the preparation for their comprehensive understanding of our country and its history. And now I'll turn it over to Mr. Scott Koenig, Social Studies Consultant here at the MDE, to usher us forward in today's session.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. Good afternoon. My name is Scott Koenig, and I am a Social Studies Consultant with the Michigan Department of Education. We are thrilled to have all of you in attendance as we continue the Comprehensive History webinar series. Before I introduce today's presenter, I want to share a few housekeeping announcements. Participants' video, audio, and chat features have been turned off. Questions for our presenter may be added using the Q&A feature, and questions will be addressed toward the end of this event if time permits. If we run out of time, we will follow up Q&A through email. We will provide a link to access a resource folder. This folder contains our presenter's outline and supporting resources for you to explore throughout today's presentation. Also, if you would like a sketch for attending today, please be sure to sign in on the sketches link that will be provided in this chat in today's presentation. You can adjust your speaker view options anytime by selecting the View button at the top right of the Zoom window. Towards the end of today's presentation, a linked survey will be presented to you at the close of this webinar. Please provide us with your feedback. Closed captioning and an American Sign Language interpreter have been provided. If closed captioning isn't automatically visible, select the Show Subtitle option. Your interpreter for today is Jennifer Atherton. Today, we welcome back Professor Pamela Brandwein, who is in the Department of Political Science at the University of Michigan. Professor Brandwein has made presentations on the slavery conflict and Reconstruction, and today will speak on the Jim Crow era. Her research interests focus on American constitutional development, race, politics, and civil rights, and American political development. And she is a specialist in the law and politics of Reconstruction. She offers courses that focus on race and political development in the 19th and 20th centuries. To save time for her presentation, we won't repeat the full introduction, except to note that she's written 2 books on the law and politics of Reconstruction and won numerous awards for her teaching. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Brandwein.
Thank you, Scott. It is a pleasure to be here for the third time. So today, my talk is going to be on the Jim Crow era. Now, the term Jim Crow is often equated with segregation laws. And these were laws that mandated racial segregation. And these are the whites only signs that were on drinking fountains, entrances to restaurants, waiting rooms, public accommodations. And legal segregation was the target of famous civil rights era campaigns, the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 and 56, the lunch counter sit-in movement that started in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960, the freedom rides that targeted interstate bus terminals, and the Birmingham campaign of 1963, and those famous images of fire hoses and attack dogs being turned on demonstrators. Now, it's useful to think about segregation laws as a system of social status. Now, social status in any context works by distance and exclusion, distance and exclusion. And legal segregation worked by distance and exclusion from whites only spaces. So you have the first class social status of whites and the second class status of African Americans. Now, the Jim Crow system also was about political exclusion, and famous civil rights era campaigns targeted that as well. You had Freedom Summer in 1964, that was a voter registration drive in Mississippi. You had the Selma to Montgomery March and those famous images from the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965. So there's social hierarchy, political exclusion, and there's also an element of forced economic dependency. And I will be talking about that as well. People are familiar with sharecropping. There's also a peonage system that I will talk about. And this connects to the first overall conceptual point of the presentation. And that is that Jim Crow was a system, social, political, economic, partly through law and segregation through law, political exclusion through law, and forced economic dependency in part through law. And these dimensions were interconnected. And so they comprise together a racial caste system affecting all African Americans. And this is a public-private hybrid, government-private hybrid, and all of it is going to be enforced by lynch law. And there's a second conceptual point. So big picture terms for the whole presentation. The second conceptual point is that there is an interrelationship between the Jim Crow system in the South and what's going on in the North, what's going on at the national level. And this pertains both to the entrenchment of the Jim Crow system, and it's important to understanding how the post-slavery low point in the United States was 1890 to about in the 1930s. That interrelationship is key to understanding the entrenchment. But that interrelationship is also important to understanding the end of legal segregation and the elimination of those voter disenfranchisement mechanisms from the 1890s. World War II is a watershed. The Cold War is going to matter. And so to understand the Jim Crow system, it's not only about the South. You have to understand this interrelationship between South and North, and this pertains to both directions. Now, another way of saying this is that the sequence in the North matters. The sequence nationally matters, from the eugenics era in the North to the New Deal to World War II to the Cold War. So that sequence is important to understanding the changing relationship between the Jim Crow system and what's going on in the North and nationally. And so I want to begin, so back to the beginning. I want to begin with what's going on in the 1890s, because that's generally regarded as the beginning of the Jim Crow era. And I can begin with the failure of the Lodge Elections Bill. I talked about this in my last presentation. This was the last gasp of Reconstruction. The Reconstruction Republicans still had the presidential wing of the party. They tried one last time for an elections bill in 1890. It failed. And the Democrats said this was a close call and we better do something. And they launched what's called the disenfranchisement movement. Now, these were new state constitutions. They started in Mississippi in 1890. And it spread across the South, first in the Deep South, and then it moved borders to the border states. And it's these state constitutions that give us classic disenfranchisement mechanisms. Now, these were neutral on their face in the sense that they didn't say one rule for Black people, another rule for white people. But everybody understood that they were primarily aimed at Black disenfranchisement. These mechanisms, the poll tax, literacy tests, understanding clauses, grandfather clauses, the white primary, these mechanisms together produced eventually, over the decade, what's called the Solid South. And this was one party rule. The Democratic Party had a lock on politics in the South. And during this time, and again, I referenced this earlier in my past presentation, the Republican Party was changing. Reconstruction era Republicans had died out, they'd lost their seats. And the Republican Party, after the failure of the Lodge Bill, abandons their effort to build a southern wing of their party. And we have a Republican getting elected in 1896. His name is William McKinley. So he's a Republican, the prior president's a Republican, and for a long time, scholars would project McKinley Republicanism backward onto early Republicanism, and that was an anachronism, that was a mistake. But McKinley is a new kind of Republican. And as a way of just sort of capturing that, the Republican presidents during Reconstruction, Grant, Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Harrison, all of them were Civil War generals. So you can think of them as the Civil War generation. McKinley was not a Civil War general. He served, but at a much lower rank. And so in the 1890s, neither political party is seeking Black votes. And in 1894, the Democrats finally succeed at repealing Reconstruction era voting rights enforcement legislation. They'd been trying to do this for a long time. They finally succeeded in 1894 because the Republican Party allowed this to happen. Now, in terms of the politics of the South at this time, the dominant group were what scholars call militant white supremacists. And their leaders were people like Ben Tillman and James Vardaman. Tillman was from South Carolina. He was the governor and a senator. Vardaman is from Mississippi, also a governor and a senator. And these were ardent white supremacists. And what distinguished them was that they defended lynching. They were active instigators of lynching, active instigators of paramilitary violence. They made regular use of the Black as beast stereotype. At the time, this was called the, quote, Black brute. You see this in newspapers, you see it in their language. So they made use of this trope, this stereotype, very frequently. Now, you have a speech from Tillman. That's in the materials. And I want to highlight some things from that speech. He opens by saying, well, he's glad that slavery is gone. And if you remember from last time, Democrats, Northern Democrats even, and Southern Democrats too said, well, okay, slavery's dead, but they had a very narrow definition about what that meant. And you're going to see in his speech, his definition of what that meant. And in that speech, he articulates all of the elements of lost cause mythology. Now, if you remember, lost cause mythology was the South's version of the war and Reconstruction, that Reconstruction oppressed the South, that it was about vindictive and vengeful radicals, that Black people were unfit for freedom. And you see this in Tillman's speech. So he says the slaves of the South were superior to the freedmen of the North, to the freedmen of today. And so slavery is actually a good condition for Black people in his speech. And then he moves on to the subject of lynching. He says, ravishing a woman was never known to occur in the South until the Reconstruction era. And this is a dual move. He's both ignoring rape by slave owners, and he's using racial ideology about Black men, that freedom unleashed this animalistic nature. He says, we will not submit to the Black man's lust for our wives and daughters without lynching him. Now, this is important because this is the major pretext for lynching that emerged during this era. And I'll have more to say about that in just a moment. Now, Tillman also blames election-related violence of Reconstruction on Blacks' quote, own hot-headedness. And so again, Blacks are blamed, but for slightly different reasons in the earlier period. He calls Reconstruction, quote, a wrong and indignity on the South. He says it was perpetrated by Northern fanatics who sought revenge. And so key elements of lost cause mythology. And he says flat out, he says that we have never recognized the right of the Black man to govern the white man. So a refusal to accept Black voting and Black office holding. And he references the South Carolina State Constitution of 1895. He says its purpose, the purpose was, quote, to disenfranchise as many of them as possible. Now, Ida B. Wells is a prominent journalist at the time. She's a prominent activist. She lived in Memphis for a period of time. She was threatened with lynching. And so she decamped to Chicago, where she did most of her work. And she was one of the first people to compile statistics on lynching. And you have two documents from her. The first one is called a red record, a bloody record. And it documents lynchings from the early 1890s. And this was the beginning of lynch law. Now, lynch law can refer to two different things, or you can find it referring to two different things. The first thing that it generally refers to is that state officials are now participating in lynching. It's not just private Klansmen in hoods, it's state officials participating, and oftentimes they're not even masked anymore. So that's the first element of lynch law. The second thing that it can describe are paramilitary groups or white mobs that are self-appointed as judge, jury, and executioner. And this is how they present themselves. And lynch law is what starts in the 1890s. And so Ida B. Wells, in a red record, is beginning to compile statistics on this. And one of the things that's notable about a red record, the first document, is that she identifies the shifting pretext for lynching. And she starts out by saying, yes, in the beginning, white people just said it was Black rioters in 1866. And then once Black men had the vote, the pretext for lynching was, we can't have Black domination. And then in the 1890s, in the context of disenfranchisement, she says the pretext is the honor of white women, and rape of white women is the pretext now for lynching. And in this regard, she's responding to Frances Willard, who was the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And Willard, in her remarks, had embraced stereotypes about Black men as being brutish and being animalistic and being aggressive. And Wells is responding. They actually have a public exchange. And in a red record, Wells is responding. Now, I just want to say something about this ideology, this logic, this ideology about the protection of white womanhood, because it's so important to understanding this pretext and how it's working. Now, white women at the time are viewed as the conservators of the white race. Their assigned role was to maintain white purity. And purity and domesticity, these are ideological concepts, and they're part of a system of gender differentiation between white men and white women. But sexual purity, as it's assigned to white women, means that they're supposed to be having white babies only. And if they had mixed race babies, that produced what was called the, quote, mongrelization of the white race. And so this racial ideology about white purity, that role is assigned to white women. And this is complex because it works in a number of ways in politics at this time. Folks like Frances Willard, president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and also organizing for women's suffrage, white middle-class activists used the purity ideology to gain access to the public sphere. And they would argue things like, well, they're going to purify society with temperance. They're going to purify politics with the vote. And if you've seen photographs of suffragists at this time, they're wearing white. They're sending a signal of white purity. And so purity is working in a complicated way in terms of women's politics. But what Ida B. Wells wants to make clear is that when either white suffragists or WCTU members are expressing support for these stereotypes about Black male aggressiveness, the Black as beasts trope, Wells is calling her out on that and is trying to explain and identify these shifting pretexts. Now, one of the things that Ida B. Wells also presented, what she also wrote about, and this is the second document, and this is a different document, and I've separated them for really pedagogical reasons, because you have to make decisions about how you want to assign these to students. Something shifted in terms of the level of brutality in lynching in this country, starting in the 1890s. And Wells refers to this as unusual brutality. And she's giving a description of these public torture lynchings that begin to happen in the United States. And it's having no effect on the white world. And in the Georgia lynching piece, she gives a description of one of these public torture lynchings. And these are community events. They are advertised. People come from all over to be a part of them. Nobody's wearing hoods, and it's an event. It's a community event. And what happens in these events is that a Black man, sometimes a Black woman, is tortured. This person is set on fire. This person dies a horrible death. And this is a community event. And what happens is that photographs are taken, and these white people gather for the photograph, and these photographs become postcards. And scholars in the last decade or so gathered these postcards to make them into an educational tool. They're available online at withoutsanctuary.org. But in the Georgia lynching excerpt, she describes one of these, and it's harrowing. And again, I've separated them so you can make decisions about age appropriateness for students. But it's important to recognize that these things happened. And so I've included them in the materials. Now, another group in the South, and this group was much less powerful. These were called the paternalists. These were the progressives, and this is the progressive era. And they were trying to build what was called the New South. These were also white supremacists. This was not an argument over white supremacy. This was not an argument over voter disenfranchisement. They supported that, but they used the different stereotype. They used the stereotype of Black as child, not Black as beast. Both of these stereotypes were inherited from the slave era, but the paternalists used the Black as child trope. They talked about Black people as naturally submissive. They rejected lynching. It was on those grounds that they departed from the militant white supremacists. And they also favored industrial education for Black men. So they would say, quote, "We can lift up the Black man, not to make him equal, but to improve him as a laborer." Okay, so other things about the 1890s that mark it as this beginning of this era. This is the era when the Confederate monuments went up. Starting in 1890, there was a Robert E. Lee statue that went up in Richmond, Virginia. The Robert E. Lee Monument in Charlottesville went up in 1924. And it's Jefferson Davis, it's all of the Civil War generals. And these monuments were things like obviously statues, but also roads, buildings, schools, courthouses. And 1890 to 1940 is the era of monument building. And the spike was in 1910. And it may or may not be a coincidence that in 1909, the NAACP was formed. And so this is the era of monument building. This is also the era of populism. And populism was a movement of farmers, agrarians. They were organizing to improve their working conditions. And so they were critical of corporate power. And they're organizing at this time. And they form something called a People's Party in the early 1890s. And most white populists supported legal segregation, social status. There were a handful of Black-white populist alliances. The one in North Carolina is the most famous. But many white elites didn't like the populist movement. And the voter disenfranchisement mechanisms that I referenced of the 1890s, these were aimed primarily at Black voting. And folks said this explicitly, but they were also aimed at disenfranchising poor whites and breaking the populist movement. Okay, let me move on to segregation laws. And these were the separate but equal laws that are probably the most familiar aspect of Jim Crow. Now, racial segregation started as a practice, and then it was codified in law. The first wave was in the Deep South, and then it moved into the border states. And this was everywhere: railroads, inns, parks, prisons, wash houses, and coal mines. It was at the circus. There was a Jim Crow Bible in court to swear on. And the way this worked legally was that there was something called the common law. And this was a judge-made law that was inherited from England. And there was a common law duty to serve the public for common carriers, transportation. And if a member of the public was willing to pay and was presentable, the common law duty was that they had to be served. And the way this shows up today is those signs you see on restaurant doors. It says no shirt, no shoes, no service. I mean, that's what this looks like today. The common law was adapted in the South in the service of legal segregation. And being Black was viewed ideologically as being just inherently less presentable, regardless of what you did. And remember, legal segregation is a system of social status. The decision Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, notice we're getting into the 1890s. Plessy versus Ferguson was a 7-1 decision, one dissenter, that gave the court's seal of approval to legal segregation. Now, this was mostly a new court. The membership had almost entirely turned over from Reconstruction. But the court said that legal segregation was in the general welfare, so it was okay. And a thing to highlight about that decision is that the court said the law was based in the nature of things, in natural distinctions based on color. And so the picture of race is as this biologically real, this scientifically real and permanent category. And in addition to that, the court said that segregation laws did not destroy legal equality. And the court identified legal equality with civil rights: property, contract, suing, testifying, the vote. The court said the 14th Amendment was not intended to enforce social equality. And the court says flat out, Black people are inferior to whites socially. And so there's a famous passage in the majority opinion where the court says, well, the fallacy of the plaintiff's argument is that they assume that it's the segregation statute that makes Black people inferior. But the court says, no, it's not the law, it's nature that makes Black people inferior. And so you see this ideology of race just suffusing the court's argument. Now, there was one dissenting opinion by Justice John Marshall Harlan. He argued that segregation statutes violated both the 13th and the 14th Amendment. He famously said that separate but equal was but a pretense of equality. It was a thin disguise of equality. And he said public accommodation rights were a civil right. And Harlan is actually embracing here a more radical Republican position. If you remember from last time, it was the radical Republicans who insisted that public accommodations were a civil right, basic to freedom. And Harlan here is articulating this position. And so to pause for a minute and make a conceptual point that I've been making in my prior presentations as well, it's important to think about racism as a continuum. And Harlan now is the example for this. Because while Harlan embraces equal access to public accommodation rights for Blacks, Harlan signs on to an opinion in 1883. The opinion is called Pace versus Alabama. And that case involved an anti-miscegenation law where there were penalties for sex outside of marriage. And the penalties for a Black-white union outside of marriage were much, much, much stiffer than penalties for a white-white union outside of marriage or a Black-Black union outside of marriage. That white-Black union was regarded as a different crime. And the very stiff penalties Harlan approved because the decision said that white-Black sex basically produced the mongrelization, there's that word again, of the white race. And so Harlan is egalitarian when it comes to public accommodation rights, but his sort of white supremacy kicks in at the point of interracial intimacy. So he also is this combination. And we need a continuum to capture Harlan as well. Now, the other conceptual point that I've been making is that racism can work, and it does work, on multiple axes at the same time. And so Harlan on Black access to public accommodation rights exists in this opinion. But Harlan also in this opinion embraces conventional anti-Chinese stereotypes. And he makes derisive comments about the Chinese. He does not support birthright citizenship for the Chinese, specifically because of beliefs he holds about the nature of the Chinese and how far they are in terms of their moral capacity and their fitness for American citizenship. And so Harlan, again, is this example for understanding that point, that dual point about how to think conceptually about racism. So, okay, let me say a couple of things about sharecropping and tenant farming, this third dimension of the Jim Crow system. Now, this was a system where landlords contracted with Black heads of households, Black families essentially, to farm land. And in exchange, that Black family got a share of the crop. Now, the way this would work is that the employer would charge the Black family for equipment, for fertilizer, for seed. So the employer did this on credit. And the credit, doing this on credit, was the way that the employer coerced that family or families into debt. And what would often happen is that the employer would cheat these families on things like the value of the crop or how much indebtedness there really was. And so there's something called peonage, Peonage. There was an anti-peonage law in Reconstruction. They made this illegal. What peonage was that if you are indebted to your employer, you could be physically forced to pay off that debt. So if they fronted you money, if you took an advance, if you're taking credit for equipment or for seed and you don't pay it off, you can be forced, literally physically coerced, to working for that person or put on a chain gang until that debt is worked off. Now today, if you accept an advance from an employer and you leave your job, you can be sued. You can be civilly liable for that money, but you're not criminally liable for it. And nobody can physically force you to do that work. Peonage is where you are physically held to do that work. And peonage is what sharecropping and tenant farming very frequently turned into, where Black families were forced into economic dependency. There were crop debtor laws where if you're in debt, the employer gets your crop. Employers would threaten eviction, and it forced Black immobility, where if you're like, well, if we're going to get evicted, we have to stay here. We have no place else to live and work off the debt. And so this immobilized Black labor. This is forced economic dependency. And so this also existed with big growers. And so in Florida, where there were sugar plantations, these growers would advertise jobs and advertise free transportation. And then once people got there, they were told that they had to work off the fee. So they were lied to. And once they got there, they were essentially trapped. And Florida had a contract labor statute, which said it made it a crime to leave a job without repaying in advance. And so you got forced labor with these big growers in Florida as well. Employers had deals with bus companies not to sell tickets to Black people. There were vagrancy laws if you were unemployed. And so there's immobilized labor for these big growers as well. But one of the things that's interesting about this part of the story is that Black men and women would send letters to the federal government saying there are slave camps in Florida, to please do something. And they're writing to the Justice Department because they think they see the national government as a place where these kinds of forced economic dependency, where slavery can be redressed. Now, one of the things, before I could turn quickly to the north, let me just quickly mention the Department of Justice in 1939 begins to shift gears, and they form what's called the Civil Rights Section in 1939. And the Attorney General is spearheading this. And the Attorney General, his name was Frank Murphy. And Frank Murphy was the mayor of Detroit. He was the governor of Michigan. He is the Attorney General at this time. And he later is appointed to the Supreme Court. And the effort to reboot Reconstruction enforcement legislation is very much due to Frank Murphy's leadership. And the Civil Rights Section at the time had all of 8 lawyers. So it's a very small group. But one of the things they were trying to do was to redress peonage in Florida. They bring the CRS, the Civil Rights Section, brings the first voting rights challenge. They actually bring down the white primary in 1944. And so this is sort of a segue to kind of now the remainder of the talk. Because I want to turn to the north and talk about the interrelationship between the Jim Crow South and what's going on in the north, what's going on nationally. But the first part is really about this entrenchment, the low point, the post-slavery low point between 1890 and 1930s. So what's going on in the north? Let me just sort of cycle through these. The first thing that's going on in the north and nationally is that social Darwinism is transitioning into this thing called eugenics. Now, Darwin, he writes in 1859, he gives this theory of natural selection where species compete to reproduce. And it was Herbert Spencer who adapts Darwinian concepts and applies them to humanity. And it's Herbert Spencer who emphasizes again, and this spreads, that Anglo-Saxons are the most evolved race. And the argument here is that social reform is fruitless because groups compete and they're going to fall out where they will. And the argument is that the current hierarchy reflects natural adaptive capacity. So don't even bother with reform, it's fruitless. Now, social Darwinism transforms into eugenics in the early 20th century. And eugenics is about racial engineering. You are intervening. And if you remember, I remember this from elementary school, Gregor Mendel and the experiments on peas. And he is the father of modern genetics. And he wrote in 1866, but his work is rediscovered in 1900. And we get racial science in its new form, which is eugenics. And this is going to spread in the United States and it's going to spread to Europe. And there's racial engineering, sterilization laws, immigration bans, and at its extreme, genocide. And so regarding this question of who belongs to America, there have been 2 answers generally to that question that have circulated in the United States. The first answer to who belongs to America is a racial, ethnic, religious answer. And it becomes about genetics during the Jim Crow era in the North. The other answer is a civic answer in terms of who belongs to America. Whoever has values about hard work and independence, and cares about equality and equal opportunity. It's that civic definition also circulates, but that civic definition didn't get to be more widespread until the 1960s. During the eugenics era, it's that first definition, the racial ethnic definition of who belongs to America. And so what's happening in the North is a number of things. First, you have the Great Migration that's gearing up. And this is the movement of the Southern Black population into northern cities, trying to escape the Jim Crow system and in search of jobs, because mechanization is happening with agriculture. In 1890, about 90% of the Black population lives in the South. By 1920, that number is only still about 85% of the Black population is living in the South. But that small number that's already migrating north by 1910, 1915 is enough to provoke really profound violence in the North. And so, and I'll talk about that. But first I want to identify the even larger numbers of folks who are coming to the United States during this time. And this is Southern and Eastern Europeans. They are coming to the United States in very, very large numbers during this time. And they are regarded as, quote, a lower order of white. They're regarded as dingy whites. They're called alien hordes. There is the threat that they are regarded as posing to Anglo-Protestant civilization. And now they're able to naturalize, because there was a naturalization law in 1790. And most folks aren't aware of this, but in 1790, there was an immigration law that said you had to naturalize as a US citizen, you had to be a, quote, free white person. And so under this statute, folks from Southern and Eastern Europe were able to naturalize, but they were regarded as culturally inferior. They were an inferior type of white, even though they were white by law. Now, there was a group of progressives at the time that argued that these Southern and Eastern Europeans could be assimilated. And this is the Americanization movement. Progressives are famous for muckraking exposés of bad meat. They're famous for their anti-monopoly organizing. They ignored Jim Crow, but they're arguing that there is a melting pot in the United States, but that melting pot really pertains to orders of whiteness. It generally does not include Blacks. It certainly does not include Asians. And so the progressives in the Americanization movement are fighting the eugenics folks. And it's during this era that the North embraces lost cause mythology, because the eugenics thinking is dominating, and there's more Northern, quote, sympathy for the Southern race problem. And so you can I'll just quickly identify some statements of presidents of the United States just to identify this. Teddy Roosevelt, Progressive era president, talked about, quote, race suicide, and he was very worried about these Southern and Eastern Europeans. Taft in 1908 said to Blacks, he said, your race is adapted to be a race of farmers, first, last, and for all time. He talked about the 15th Amendment as producing, quote, domination by an ignorant electorate. He called Reconstruction a failure. Woodrow Wilson, elected in 1912, reelected in 1916. He talked about the Ku Klux Klan as saving the South from, quote, ignorant Blacks. It was Wilson who segregated federal administrative agencies. He famously screened the film Birth of a Nation, which is a lost cause expression, in the White House. Calvin Coolidge in 1925 said that, quote, biological laws show that Nordics deteriorate when mixed with other races. And it's Madison Grant, who is one of the main exponents of eugenics thinking. And he was a champion of what was called Nordicism, from Nordic countries, Nordicism. And he talked about white world supremacy. And he worried with the Southern and Eastern Europeans coming in about the, quote, passing of the great race. That was the title of one of his books in 1916. Now, just to mention a bit of the immigration laws that were passed during this time, because these immigration laws were eugenics laws. In 1917, all Asians, Asians from all countries except from Japan were barred from immigrating to the United States. And the legal rule was racial unassimilability. That was the legal grounds for this. The Chinese were the first group to be barred back in 1882. And 1882 was the height of the anti-Chinese movement on the West Coast. And you had, California Governor Bigler talking about the Chinese as, quote, a moral evil. The Chinese degraded white labor. The Chinese were referred to as, quote, biped domestic animals. And this ideology of a yellow peril already was circulating in the United States in the 1870s. There were mass lynchings of the Chinese in Los Angeles. And so by the time you get to 1917, it's all Asian countries. Now, in 1924, the United States passed what was called the National Origins Act. And this was the beginning of quotas. And this was immigration law, eugenics law that was praised by Hitler at the time. And what this law did, it worked on two dimensions. I don't have a lot of time to talk about it in much detail, but it worked on two dimensions. And the first dimension was that it divided Europe from non-Europe. So non-Europe is barred, and now Japan is barred also. Europeans were let in, but Northern and Western Europeans were let in at much, much, much higher levels than Southern and Eastern Europeans. This was a measure to block and to really reduce Southern and Eastern Europeans. These were, again, the lower races of Europe. And so at this time, it's not just that Italians were Catholic and there was anti-Catholic stereotyping, but Italian, you now added the stereotype that Italians were also anarchists. Jews now were also Bolsheviks. So these stereotypes were folded into what was already an ideology about a lower order of white. And so Madison Grant, let me just quickly mention, you have a document from him on the 1924 Act, and he disparages, and you can see this, he disparages confidence in the melting pot. He says that the lesson of the Civil War was, quote, undigested racial material. And he said there are large bodies of people already in the United States who were, quote, racially incompatible with Nordic populations. And he said America is for a pure white Nordic race. Those Mediterranean dark types were what he called alien hordes. And he said those alien hordes will, quote, mongrelize, there's that word again, the white population. Now, to mention the violence, Red Summer, Bloody Summer, 1919. I've mentioned the Great Migration is starting, it's ticking up, and World War I had defense jobs for Black workers, and folks are coming north looking for work. And in 1919, there were over 25 racial massacres across the country, northern and southern cities, started by whites, lynchings, firebombings of Black houses. The three most violent, one was in Chicago, this lasted 2 weeks. Washington, D.C., it lasted 5 days. You have a primary document about this from George Haynes, who wrote a report to the Senate. He was trying to get Congress to pass anti-lynching legislation. Black soldiers were often the targets, and Black wealth was a target. The Tulsa riot in 1921, where 35 city blocks were destroyed, Black Wall Street, as it was known. This was enormously destructive, and it's targeted at this time frame too. Now, just to mention, the term Red Summer was coined by James Weldon Johnson. He was a field secretary for the NAACP. James Weldon Johnson was also a figure in the Harlem Renaissance. And it's important to recognize that even as the 1920s was the height of the eugenics movement, you also see the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. And so eugenics doesn't define every bit of American culture and politics at this time. You see in New York City this vibrant intellectual and cultural life, but it's localized. Okay, one more thing before I turn to World War II. The New Deal programs. The New Deal programs, some folks are aware that the Social Security benefits that came out of the New Deal programs excluded Blacks. And they did that, again, not facially, but New Deal programs excluded agricultural and domestic workers. Those were the categories that were excluded. They were excluded from Social Security benefits, and there were other elements of the New Deal that excluded agricultural and domestic workers. Those workers were excluded from public relief projects. They were excluded from minimum wage and maximum hour laws. The Wagner Act of 1935 gave unions and collective bargaining things that they had been seeking for a long time, but the Wagner Act permitted unions to segregate. There were what were called Jim Crow locals in the North. And so New Deal legislation is often framed as this is the price that had to be paid to Southern Democrats for getting it passed. But there were policies that came out of the New Deal, like redlining, and I'll say just a word about that weren't a concession to anybody, that this was a policy coming out of the Roosevelt administration, and it had profound effects with these New Deal policies on wealth inequalities today. Now, just one more thing to mention about the New Deal, or really about the Depression that just preceded it. During the Depression, there was something called Mexican repatriation, where American citizens were deported without process. 1.8 million people were deported during the Depression. About 60% of them were US citizens. They were Mexican Americans without process. And this was framed as American jobs for Americans, with a presumption, and Mexican repatriation was the term of Herbert Hoover, presenting America as not for Mexican Americans. And so that's important to mention in this context of the Depression and the New Deal. Now, these redlining maps, you have an absolutely wonderful digital tool in the resources, and it comes from the Mapping Inequality Project. What they have done is take all of the redlining maps that were made by the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Authority in the 1930s. And these maps were used as a basis for underwriting mortgages, for getting mortgages. And what you have in this resource is not only the actual maps. You can click on it and see which areas were redlined, and the areas that were redlined were excluded from getting mortgages. You actually have the reasons that the government gave for saying we're not going to give mortgages in this area. And the hazardous rating said things like, quote, infiltration of Black people as the reason. And we know now that when you controlled for everything, scholarship has been done on this, when you control for income, savings, financial resources, responsibility, all of those things, it comes down to double standards by race. And so you have this wonderful tool. And so, okay, let me, in my final moments, the last bit of time, let me turn to World War II and say something about the Cold War, because World War II is a watershed, and the interrelationship between the Jim Crow South and the North shifts. And it shifts because of Nazism and the Holocaust. And a larger segment of the white population in the North now comes to reject eugenics, comes to reject white supremacist ideology, because they see where it has led. And so you have a shift in the Northern white population as a function of the Holocaust. And Black soldiering matters again. And civil rights organizations get stronger after World War II. And the Department of Justice, as I referenced earlier, has rebooted their effort to fight Jim Crow voter disenfranchisement laws. And one of the things that's important to recognize about World War II is that it's this marker in national integration. People are moving around. There's more national interconnectedness. And that seems to be related to opposition to the Jim Crow system. And so at the state level, and this is interesting, at the state level, you see Northern Democrats begin to embrace fair employment legislation. And so New York State passes fair employment practices in 1945, and it's the first state fair employment law. And if you look at data from 1946 to 1948, this is the beginning of a shift in the North at the state level. So congressmen in the Senate and Congress, state legislatures, 46 to 48, you start to see Northern Democrats supporting civil rights reform. And you need Northern votes to get rid of legal segregation. You need Northern votes to get rid of those 1890s disenfranchisement mechanisms. And so the shift in the North is going to be vital to understanding. It's going to be vital to understanding a shifting dynamic now between North and South. And interestingly, or not coincidentally, 1946 to 1948 is also the point, and again, we have data on this. This is the point at which African Americans begin moving into the Democratic Party. It's not all at once. Hi, Scott. It's not all at once, but 1946 to 1948 is when you see Blacks moving into the Democratic Party. And then 1948, Truman, he desegregates federal administrative agencies. Wilson had segregated them, Truman desegregates them. Truman also desegregates the military in 1948. This is also when Jackie Robinson broke the color line in baseball in 1947. The 1948 Democratic Convention, a civil rights platform, fair employment practices, desegregation. And this is what provoked what's called the Dixiecrat Revolt. And they formed what was called the States' Rights Party, and you have their platform. And what they say in their platform is, quote, "We stand for the segregation of races. We favor home rule. We condemn the civil rights program of the Democratic National Convention." They called it totalitarian. And just a note on the Cold War. The US at this time is condemning the Soviet Union for human rights abuses. The USSR turns back around, the Soviets point the finger right back at the United States and say, "You're condemning us for human rights violations? Look what's going on in the Jim Crow South." And so when it comes to foreign policy, there were elements at the highest levels of US government that saw the Jim Crow system as an albatross around their neck and was hurting the US capacity to engage in geopolitics. And so when you get Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, this is actually following all of these developments. It's not leading the way in this way. It's actually following this. And Brown is about the desegregation of primary schools, and it's not enforced until the 1960s. But it's very important symbolically, and we know this from scholarship that's been done on civil rights organizations. Brown is important symbolically for hope. And so the civil rights campaigns, this is where I started my talk. The civil rights campaigns in the South were driving the challenge to segregation laws and to voter exclusion. They're the engine. But after World War II and with the Cold War, it's taking place, that engine is taking place in a changed nation. And now after 1945, 46, there start to be growing Northern Democratic votes for supporting those efforts. And so legal segregation comes down with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Title II. Those 1890s voter disenfranchisement mechanisms come down in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. The economic system is still in play in many ways. The effects of redlining are very deep. The exclusions from New Deal social welfare programs are durable. And so there are durable legacies in these ways. And lost cause mythology. It wouldn't have gotten entrenched without Northern assent. And so that has legacies. And really, the conflicts of the Jim Crow era don't go away. They evolve. The Dixiecrats don't go away. The economy is going to transform from an industrial base to a technology and service base, and that brings with it new sets of complexities. And so just as the conflict over slavery evolved after the Civil War, the conflicts of the Jim Crow era evolve after this major civil rights legislation in the 1960s. All right, I will stop there. Scott, back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Brandwein, for sharing this knowledge throughout this three-part series. I can't believe we're wrapping it up at this point. I feel like let's keep going. This is amazing. So we can't thank you enough for your expertise and taking time to share this knowledge with us. It is incredibly important. Your work specifically is really important to helping Michigan educators teach comprehensive history within their classrooms. We can't thank you enough. Our next three-part webinar series continues on February 8th, 15th, and 22nd from 4 to 5 p.m. The next series is entitled Civil Rights Movement, National and Michigan Views. Please note that each webinar will present new content, so we encourage educators to register if you haven't already for each date to participate in future webinars by visiting the registration page that's linked in the chat box for you. Please register if you haven't again, and invite a friend to join us as we grow this series and get the word out. Thank you all for joining us today. Please make sure to complete the survey for this event that will be shared with you when you close out of the webinar. And again, make sure you grab the Sketches link before you exit. Everyone have a great rest of the day.